Hey guys, tonight we slip down to the southern coast of England where the cliffs stand tall and the waves gnaw at them with endless patience. The salty air stings your nose, gulls screech overhead, and the tide pushes against your boots. This is Lyme Regis, a seaside town where storms can shake the windows and flood the streets, and where in 1799 a baby girl named Mary Anning takes her very first breath. You might think being born in a stormy port town is dramatic enough, but no, she's born into a world where survival is already a coin toss. Infant mortality hovers around 50%. You probably wouldn't survive this opening scene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight and what's the local time on your clock? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the fire in a cramped cottage where the Annings live, packed together with too little money and too much damp air. Mary is the 10th child of Richard and Molly, though only a couple of her siblings survive into adulthood. You imagine the midwife wiping her brow, whispering a quick prayer, then handing the small infant over. For a moment, everyone exhales. Another fragile life has entered this precarious household. Her father, Richard, is a cabinet maker by trade, but that doesn't quite pay the bills in Lyme Regis, so he has a sideline scouring the cliffs for curiosities. You know, odd spiral shells, chunks of bone-like stone, shiny bits that rich tourists might pay for as souvenirs. Back then, no one calls them fossils. With scientific gravitas, they're just trinkets. Some folks even think they're sports of nature rocks that grew funny shapes just to mess with human minds. Historians still argue whether Richard really believed in these superstitions, or whether he secretly suspected there was something more profound buried in the layers of stone. What you do know, he straps little Mary into a sling and takes her with him even as a toddler, pointing at ammonites lodged in the cliff face. Picture that before she can even spell her name, her world is littered with relics older than humanity itself. But Lyme Regis is not a gentle playground. The sea air corrodes wood, floods rot the cottages, and the cliffs collapse without warning. You smell the damp, hear the rain pounding the slate roofs. Disease spreads easily here, smallpox, measles, and the dreaded consumption. It's a lottery every morning just to wake up healthy. Yet there's a strange magic in this harsh upbringing. Mary, small and sharp-eyed, learns to see details others miss. She spots shells wedged in cracks, traces of fins or teeth poking from mud. She hears the grown-ups gossip about snake stones and devil's toenails, and she tucks those phrases away like treasures. Then an odd, almost whimsical fact from her early childhood. When she's about 15 months old, she's struck by lightning. Not directly, but close enough. She's being held under a tree during a sudden storm, and a bolt flashes down. 3 women standing nearby are killed instantly. Mary somehow survives, though she'd been limp and silent in her caretaker's arms until she suddenly revived. From then on, locals mutter, "She's blessed." Imagine growing up with that whispered around you, your life framed as a miracle before you can even remember it. You fast forward a little. She grows into a wiry, curious child. Instead of playing with dolls, she clambers over rocks, her fingers tracing spirals in limestone. The cliffs of Lyme Regis are part of what geologists later call the Jurassic coast, layers upon layers of ancient seabeds, stacked like pancakes of time. For now, though, they're just unstable cliffs that occasionally drop boulders the size of oxen. You hear the crack of stone, the thud, as it smashes on the beach, the spray of pebbles in your hair. And there's Mary staring not in fear, but with the sparkle of opportunity. New treasures might have just fallen free. The family, meanwhile, is constantly counting pennies. Bread, rent, firewood, they never have enough. Richard's cabinets don't sell well, and his fossil trinkets fetch only small change. Still, he insists on teaching Mary the names, the places, the way to spot a fossil half hidden under seaweed. Her mother scolds him, why teach a girl these odd hobbies? But Richard smiles, his lungs rattling already with what doctors call consumption, what you know as tuberculosis. You can see where this is going. Historians still argue whether Mary's fascination was natural genius or simply the only inheritance her father could pass down before his early death. Either way, her childhood days by the sea are shaping her into someone who will change science forever. For now, though, she's just another poor kid chasing curiosities, her bare feet cold on the wet shingle, her pockets heavy with stones. And the wind howls along the Dorset coast, whispering that much bigger discoveries lie ahead. You shuffle along the beach beside Mary as she grows into her childhood years, the waves foaming white at your ankles, the cliffs looming like massive, half-crumbling books of stone. Lyme Regis isn't exactly a playground filled with swings and ice cream stands. It's more like a rugged outdoor museum with constant danger written in every creak of shifting rock. And this is where Mary spends most of her days, pockets jingling with stones, eyes darting across the ground for shapes that don't quite belong. Her brother Joseph often tags along. He's a little older, steady, and sometimes a bit bossy, but the two of them make a decent team. Imagine them barefoot trousers rolled their hair salted stiff by the sea breeze. They argue over whether a particular shell is worth keeping, and sometimes Joseph wins. Sometimes Mary just slips it into her pocket. Anyway, that's the thing you already sense. She's not the type to let a good fossil escape her grasp. The Annings' cottage sits on Broad Street, cramped and smoky from the little fire that barely warms the rooms. Their mother Molly keeps house with an air of permanent exhaustion. Dinners are often thin broth or bread, stretched as far as it can go. Yet outside the door, the cliffs call. They offer not food exactly, but the possibility of coins if a curious traveller buys a fossil. And that possibility keeps Mary and Joseph combing the shoreline every chance they get. One mainstream fact, the town of Lyme Regis was already something of a tourist stop in Mary's youth. The wealthy came to take the waters and promenade along the Cobb, the curved stone harbour wall. You picture finely dressed ladies holding parasols, eyeing the same rocks Mary has just kicked over. These visitors sometimes bought fossils as oddities to display in cabinets back home. It wasn't enough to make the Anning family rich, but it kept bread on the table now and then. Now for a quirkier tidbit, locals had their own superstitions about these stones. Ammonites, those spiral shells, were thought to be petrified snakes. People carved little snake heads onto them and sold them as curios. Folks called them snake stones and claimed St. Hilda had turned a whole nest of snakes into stone. You can just imagine Mary, a girl with mud-streaked cheeks, overhearing these stories and rolling her eyes. She knows perfectly well it's a shell, not some cursed reptile. Historians still argue whether Mary, even as a child, had an instinctive grasp of fossils as once living creatures, or whether that understanding developed slowly as she kept digging. After all, the scientific community itself hadn't fully decided. Extinction, for example, was a controversial idea. How could God's creation allow animals to vanish? Some insisted every species ever created must still exist, perhaps tucked away on a remote island. Others whispered the earth was far older than the Bible suggested. And here's little Mary running her fingers across a shell that predates humanity by millions of years, though of course she can't yet know the numbers. Her father Richard keeps guiding her when he can. He teaches her how to chip carefully with a hammer, how to spot the faint ripple of bone in limestone, how to watch for sudden landslides. He jokes that the cliffs have moods, sometimes generous, sometimes deadly. Mary listens wide-eyed, storing away every detail. Her bond with her father is quiet but strong, each fossil trip a kind of lesson in survival and wonder. The sensory world here is vivid, the tang of salt, the crunch of shingle underfoot, the sting of cold rain on your cheeks. You smell seaweed drying in the sun, hear the crash of waves against the Cobb. And in all of it, Mary finds her education. She doesn't have expensive tutors or fancy books. Her classroom is the cliffs, her textbook is the stone, and her pencil is the hammer her father hands her. Of course, kids still find ways to play. Imagine Mary making a little pile of ammonites pretending they're coins in a game of shop, or throwing them like skipping stones across the tide pools only to get scolded for wasting what could be sold. And when storms sweep in, the family huddles inside, waiting for the rain to stop before the next fossil hunt. At night, you picture her lying awake in the cramped upstairs room, listening to the sea's eternal roar. Outside, Lanterns flicker on Broad Street, the smell of wood smoke wafts in, and Mary's mind turns over the day's finds. Did she miss something in that last rockfall? Is there something still hidden in the mud? Already her imagination pulls her toward the treasures still locked away beneath the cliffs. And it's during these childhood years that the rhythm of her life becomes clear: survival and discovery, danger and wonder. A poor girl from a damp seaside town clutching spiral stones that will someday rewrite natural history. For now, she's just a child with muddy boots, but the cliffs are already whispering secrets to her, waiting for the day she's ready to dig deeper. You're back on the beach, the air damp with morning fog, and you hear the rasp of a cough echoing from behind you. Richard Anning leans on his hammer, his face pale, his chest rattling with each breath. Consumption, that's what they call it though. You'd know it today as tuberculosis. It's eating him from the inside, and no amount of seaside air can cure it. Mary watches him carefully, knowing that every trip to the cliffs with him could be the last. For a time, he still tries. He takes her hand, points at a fossil half hidden in a slab, and shows her how to work the edge without shattering it. His hands tremble, his voice rasps, but his patience is endless. Imagine the bitter sweetness of it. Each fossil lesson is tinged with the knowledge that her teacher is slipping away. Inside the cottage, the atmosphere is heavy. Molly tries to keep spirits up, but you smell the smoke of cheap candles, the damp walls, the lingering fear that comes when the family's breadwinner falters. The Annings are already poor. Richard's death would mean disaster. And sure enough, when he passes in 1810, Mary is just 11 years old. You stand at the back of the small, somber funeral watching the family cling together. He leaves debts behind, as well as children who suddenly have to fend for themselves. It's not a fairy tale moment of the young girl decides to be brave. It's more like survival pressed down onto her shoulders. If she and Joseph don't keep selling fossils, there simply won't be food on the table. No choice, no luxury, just the necessity of scraping at the cliffs until someone buys. But before the father's death, there was already a spark of discovery. One mainstream historical fact around 1809, Joseph uncovers the first major piece that hints at a skeleton of something bigger than the spiral shells and odd teeth they usually sell. It looks like part of a crocodile skull. At least that's what most people assume. After all, what else could it be? But the thing is larger, heavier, and stranger than any crocodile from local rivers. Mary, still young, peers at it with wide eyes. She helps her brother chip it free, her small fingers steady despite the risk of rock falls. They carry the chunk home, setting it by the hearth like a guardian monster. Visitors stare curious but skeptical. A crocodile, a dragon, a prank by nature itself. Historians still argue whether locals believed the Annings had stumbled onto a known animal or something entirely new. Here's a quirky tidbit. You can't miss the family. Sometimes sold fossils right outside their cottage door, setting them on tables like cabbages or apples. Imagine walking through town, seeing Mary, a girl with wind-tangled hair, leaning over a little stall of ammonites vertebrae and odd lumps, calling out prices like a market hawker. Fossils weren't glamorous yet. They were curiosities, novelties, maybe paperweights. No one suspected they would soon shake the foundations of science. Mary, however, feels the thrill. She senses the skull Joseph pulled from the cliffs isn't just decoration. She can't name it, but she knows it matters. You picture her lying in bed that night, candle guttering low, staring at the skull's jagged teeth, imagining them alive, biting through fish, millions of years ago. The thought sends a shiver through her, half fear, half wonder. And here's the tough reality. After Richard's death, Joseph eventually finds work as an upholsterer's apprentice, which means the fossil hunting falls more and more to Mary. She's still a child scrambling across treacherous slopes, hammer in hand, skirts dragging in the mud. Landslides rumble down, sudden and deadly. You flinch as boulders tumble past her, but she doesn't retreat. Every fall of rock is an opportunity. Something might have been knocked loose, something no one has seen before. The Annings' poverty sharpens Mary's determination. It's not about scientific glory, not yet. It's about a few shillings to buy bread and keep the fire burning. But the cliffs don't care about her hunger. They give and take at random. Sometimes she finds nothing for weeks. Sometimes a single strike of her hammer changes everything. And as you walk beside her through those hard years, you can't shake the feeling that Richard's ghost lingers, his lessons etched into her every careful strike, his presence woven into the sound of stone against stone. His absence leaves a hole in the family, but it also presses Mary closer to the fossils, as though she's been left with one final inheritance, the patience to keep looking when others would give up. By now, she's beginning to sense that her finds are part of something larger, bigger than the gossip of neighbours or the coins of tourists. The cliffs are holding secrets, and Mary Anning is just stubborn enough to drag them out into the light. The beach is cold wind biting at your cheeks as you watch Mary crouch low beside her brother Joseph. It's 1811, and the two of them are poking at a jagged edge of stone that juts from a cliff fall. Joseph has the hammer, but Mary's the one directing him, sharp-eyed, steady, already the true hunter. With each strike, the stone yields just a little more until a curved snout and teeth come into view. A skull, a massive skull. At first glance, it seems like a crocodile, but bigger, stranger, almost alien. The jaws stretch longer than any crocodile in the rivers of Dorset. The teeth are sharp, conical, made for gripping slippery prey. The children stare at it in awe. And even though Joseph technically claims the find, it's Mary who insists they keep going. She wants to see the whole thing. And so through winter storms and long hours of chipping, Mary slowly unearths the body attached to that skull. She digs carefully, methodically, like she's been training her whole short life for this moment. By the time she's finished, laid out before her is something that no one in Lyme Regis has ever seen complete the skeleton of what would later be called an ichthyosaur. A fish lizard, though it looks more like a sea monster from a medieval map. Here's the mainstream fact: this 1811-1812 discovery becomes the first significant ichthyosaur skeleton known to science. It's sold to a collector, displayed in London, and eventually studied by the likes of Everard Home, one of the Royal Society's naturalists. At the time, it's a sensation, though most of the credit flows to the gentlemen who write about it, not the poor girl who actually found it. But in the moment, it's not fame or science Mary feels, it's awe. Imagine standing over the laid-out bones, the curve of a rib cage, the sweep of a tail, the sockets where huge eyes once stared. For a girl who grew up hearing fossils were sports of nature, this is proof of something far bigger. Now for the quirky tidbit: when news of the skeleton spreads, some people insist it must be a distorted crocodile. Others mutter about it being a sea dragon. And in one particularly strange interpretation, a few churchgoers claim it's evidence of creatures drowned in Noah's flood. You have to laugh. Mary unearths a 200-million-year-old animal, and people still try to jam it into a biblical boat story. Historians still argue whether Mary herself believed in extinction at this point. Did she think the ichthyosaur represented a species lost forever? Or did she imagine, like some naturalists, that they still swam in distant, unexplored seas? The answer is murky, but what's clear is her fascination never wavers. The ichthyosaur discovery changes her life. Suddenly the Annings aren't just peddling little ammonites to tourists, they're selling something that garners serious attention. A collector buys the skeleton for $23, an enormous sum compared to what they usually earn. It pays off debts, keeps food on the table, and gives Mary her first taste of how fossils can transform more than just stone. Still, it's not exactly smooth sailing. The townsfolk eye the Annings with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Some admire their luck, others whisper that they're meddling with unnatural things, and Mary, she just keeps hunting. The cliffs are dangerous, the pay uncertain, but she knows there are more bones waiting. You crouch beside her as she works. Her fingers are quick, her concentration absolute. She talks to Joseph about what the creature might have looked like, alive, its giant eyes peering through the water, its long body flicking like a dolphin. Maybe it hunted fish just offshore where she now sits. The idea makes her shiver, not with fear, but with a strange connection across time. And then there's the London attention. Imagine Mary hearing second-hand that gentlemen in wigs are debating her find in lecture halls. They sketch her ichthyosaur, published descriptions argue over what it means. Her name is barely mentioned, if at all. She's just a girl from Lyme who happened to dig up something they get to analyze. But deep down, you suspect Mary doesn't care about their debates, at least not yet. What matters is the thrill of finding something real, something no one else had touched for millions of years. On stormy nights, she dreams of more creatures hiding in the cliffs. The thunder shakes the cottage windows, and Mary lies awake, listening, imagining the rocks themselves speaking, urging her back to the beach. The ichthyosaur has given her proof the cliffs are full of monsters, and she is the one destined to find them. The world doesn't know it yet, but Mary Anning has just cracked open a doorway to prehistory, and once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, you can't shut it again. The ichthyosaur discovery should have been the happily ever after moment, but you know, life doesn't hand those out so easily. For Mary, the fossil wasn't just a scientific marvel, it was rent money, survival cash, and little more. Once the $23 was gone, the Anning family slipped back into the rhythm of poverty, long days on the beach, selling ammonites and belemnites to tourists, haggling with collectors who always seemed to have more coin than conscience. You walk beside Mary along the shingle, her skirts damp from the spray, as she scans the cliff face like someone reading a coded book. Hunger gnaws at her belly, but she hardly notices. She's too busy searching. Her mother, Molly, waits at home, scraping together meals from whatever they can afford. Bread stretched with broth stretched with water. Mary knows the fossils aren't just curiosities, they're lifelines. The townspeople, meanwhile, cast their judgments. Some sneer at the Anning family for crawling around in the mud like rag pickers. Others mutter superstitions: that girl's cursed, that girl's blessed, depending on who's telling the tale. Remember, this is the same Mary who'd survived a lightning strike as a baby. People whisper about it like a mark of fate. You almost chuckle. If surviving storms and landslides is a curse, then Mary is cursed and stubborn enough to carry it proudly. Here's the mainstream fact. Early 19th century Britain was a brutal place to be poor, especially in coastal towns. There were no safety nets, no welfare programs, just charity or starvation. Fossil hunting was Mary's form of day labor, except instead of digging coal, she dug up bones from 200 million years ago. She worked harder than most men in the parish, yet still lived one step away from destitution. Now the quirky tidbit: some of Mary's earliest customers weren't scientists at all, but tourists who bought fossils as souvenirs. They'd carry them home in little boxes, setting them on mantelpieces beside porcelain teacups or seashells. A spiral ammonite was about as significant to them as a snow globe might be today. Imagine someone using an ichthyosaur vertebra as a paperweight. You sigh, science hadn't caught up yet. Historians still argue whether Mary felt bitterness at this point. Was she resentful of collectors who bought her finds for pennies, then sold them in London for pounds? Or was she just too focused on the hunt, too practical to waste time on anger? We'll never know for certain, but her persistence suggests she found purpose in the fossils themselves, regardless of who claimed credit. You picture her trudging home with a sack of ammonites slung across her shoulder, the weight dragging at her back. She stops occasionally, prying out another spiral, brushing sand from her fingers. Each fossil is like a coin from the Earth's hidden treasury, but most are worth only a few shillings. Still, she keeps at it, driven by something stronger than profit curiosity. The cliffs are her daily companions. They rumble, crack, and sometimes collapse without warning. You imagine her pausing as pebbles trickle down the face, deciding whether to press closer or retreat. The risk is always there, yet she chooses to stay. Every collapse is also an unveiling, and she can't resist the chance that something extraordinary lies inside. Back in town, she isn't just the fossil girl, she's also the breadwinner. At barely 13, she shoulders responsibilities many adults couldn't bear. Neighbors might pity her, but they don't truly understand the depth of her resilience. She's not playing with curiosities, she's keeping her family alive. The contrast is striking. Gentlemen in London debate her ichthyosaur in stuffy lecture halls, puffing pipes, adjusting spectacles. They argue over its anatomy, whether it's reptile or fish, whether it proves extinction or not. Meanwhile, Mary crouches in the mud, scraping at limestone with a borrowed tool hand's raw hair, whipped by the wind. Same bones, two worlds. And through it all, Mary begins to sharpen her eye. She notices details others miss, tiny fish bones, delicate imprints, subtle curves in stone. Her patience is legendary. While others rush, she waits. Where others see plain rock, she senses hidden history. You can almost hear her whisper to herself, "There's something here." By the end of the day, the sun dips low, painting the cliffs orange, and Mary gathers her finds into a basket. She hauls them back up Broad Street to the cramped cottage. Her mother greets her with tired eyes but relief that there's something to sell tomorrow. The ichthyosaur may have been the first great triumph, but the grind of poverty still dictates Mary's life. You can't help but marvel most people would have given up, left the cliffs behind, but Mary keeps at it, not because she chooses the hardship, but because the fossils have become part of her. The cliffs call and she answers day after day, storm after storm. You walk the shoreline with Mary, the cliffs towering over you like giant walls of a crumbling fortress. She's older now, her frame still wiry, her stride quick, her eyes sharper than ever. Each morning begins the same way, a hammer in hand, a basket slung over her shoulder, and the weight of her family's survival pressing on her back. But something new is happening. Word of her discoveries has begun to spread beyond Lyme Regis. Collectors and gentlemen scholars, men with polished boots and polished accents, have started to arrive in town, eager to peer at the strange bones this poor girl keeps pulling from the earth. One mainstream fact, the early 1800s saw a surge of interest in geology and natural history among Britain's elite. Fossils were becoming fashionable. The Geological Society of London was founded in 1807 and members wanted specimens to study. Mary's finds suddenly mattered not just as trinkets for tourists, but as evidence for debates about Earth's age, extinction, and God's design. The scholars, however, didn't exactly treat Mary as an equal. They came in fine carriages, knocked on the cottage door, and haggled over prices as if bargaining for cabbages. They admired the bones, yes, but rarely credited the young woman who risked her life to find them. Instead, they wrote papers with their own names at the top. You shake your head, it's like watching someone swipe homework answers and still get the gold star. Now the quirky tidbit, one of the most famous collectors, Henry Host Henley, was said to have displayed fossils in his home almost like trophies alongside hunting gear and paintings. To him, Mary's monsters were status symbols, proof of his taste and wealth. Imagine guests sipping wine in his drawing room while pointing at Mary's ichthyosaur, remarking, "Oh yes, quite the curiosity," as though it were a stuffed pheasant. Historians still argue whether Mary resented these men or whether she saw them simply as customers' buyers who kept her family afloat. Letters suggest she was often frustrated, especially when her knowledge far outstripped theirs. After all, she knew the cliffs intimately, could identify bones at a glance, while many of the so-called experts fumbled over basic anatomy. Yet she lacked the formal education, the social standing, the polished Latin to defend her insights. You follow her one afternoon as a group of gentlemen trail behind, puffing and sweating as they attempt to climb the same rock. She scrambles up with ease. They ask questions, scribble notes, and sometimes patronize her with condescending praise. Clever girl. Mary bites her tongue, but you can sense her irritation. She doesn't need their validation, she needs their money. Yes, but not their pats on the head. And still the cliffs keep rewarding her persistence. She uncovers delicate fish skeletons, sharp teeth, coiled shells. Each find goes onto a table outside the cottage, where curious visitors browse as if shopping at a seaside market. The juxtaposition is almost comic, fossils that will one day rewrite natural history, sold beside baskets of shells, their value not yet fully understood. Yet the ichthyosaur isn't forgotten. Copies of it, sketches of it circulate in learned circles. The name Anning begins to float like a rumor, never fully acknowledged, never printed in bold, but whispered among collectors, the Lyme Regis girl who finds monsters. Back home, the family still lives in poverty. Bread remains thin, the firewood, scarce debts never far off. The Annings aren't lifted into wealth or comfort. Instead, Mary's life becomes a balancing act survival in the present discovery for the future. Each fossil is both a meal ticket and a puzzle piece in a story larger than she can yet imagine. One evening, you sit with her on the beach as the tide creeps in. She runs her fingers over an ammonite, tracing its spiral, and mutters about patterns, how nature repeats itself, how the smallest shell mirrors the grandest creatures. Her thoughts tumble out like waves, unpolished but profound. She doesn't need books to see connections. She reads them straight from the stone. And as the stars prick the night sky, you realize this isn't just a girl selling curiosities. This is someone quietly, stubbornly shaping science with every swing of her hammer. The scholars might not say it aloud yet, but they're starting to notice. Mary Anning, fossil hunter of Lyme Regis, is becoming impossible to ignore. You trudge up Broad Street with Mary the basket on her arm, heavier than usual, the smell of damp stone clinging to her clothes. She's just come from the cliffs with another batch of fossils, fish, imprints, a jawbone, maybe a vertebra or two. The sort of things that might catch the eye of a visiting collector. And lately, those collectors aren't just random tourists. They're men in crisp coats, carrying notebooks, who speak of specimens and catalogues in voices loud enough for the whole inn to hear. One mainstream fact: by the 1820s, Mary Anning's name had quietly reached the attention of the Geological Society's members, though not formally acknowledged because women weren't allowed to join. She was in effect a shadow member, her fossils filling their cabinets, her discoveries fueling their debates. But in the Society's official papers, she was invisible. You watch her lead a gentleman scholar down to the beach. He slips and curses on the pebbles, while Mary strides ahead, hammer tapping against her side. He peppers her with questions, some intelligent, some laughably basic. She answers patiently, but there's a flicker in her eyes every time he acts as if he's the one making the discovery. You can almost hear her thoughts. I've spent my life on these cliffs, you just arrived in polished boots. Here's the quirky tidbit: one of her frequent customers was Thomas Birch, a wealthy collector who felt guilty that Mary and her family lived in poverty while he profited from her finds. In 1820, he auctioned off much of his collection and gave the proceeds to the Annings. Imagine that a gentleman deciding his conscience outweighed his coin purse. It didn't make them rich, but it kept them afloat through another lean season. Historians still argue whether Mary ever fully trusted these gentlemen. Some were genuinely kind, giving her credit in private letters. Others were opportunistic, buying her fossils cheap and reselling them in London for fortunes. To Mary, every transaction was complicated gratitude mixed with suspicion, survival tied to the whims of men who never had to scrape mud from their boots. The scene plays out again and again. A carriage rattles into town. A man in a fine hat steps out asking for Miss Anning. Mary guides him along the cliffs, shows him where to stand, where not to step. She points to a protruding bone, her voice calm, while he gawks like a child. Later, he'll write a letter to a colleague, bragging about the specimen he secured. Mary's name, if mentioned at all, will be tucked between commas, and yet she keeps at it. Not for their praise, not even for their recognition, but because the cliffs still whisper their secrets to her. She digs because she must, because the bones are there, waiting. And slowly, reluctantly, the men of science are forced to admit they need her. You picture one of those drawing room scenes in London, scholars in wigs pipes, smoking a fossil propped on a velvet cushion. They debate what it means, fish, lizard monster of the flood, while someone clears his throat and mutters, "It was found by the girl in Lyme Regis." A murmur passes around the room. They know her at least as a rumour, the girl who keeps finding monsters. Mary doesn't hear these conversations firsthand, but scraps of recognition drift back to her through letters and whispers. She doesn't see her name in the journals, but she knows her specimens are there, described in ink. It's a strange kind of fame, visible bones, invisible finder. One evening, as you walk with her along the cob, the sea pounding against the stones, she mutters something half to herself. They'll write what they please, but I know what I've seen. Her voice is steady, her eyes fixed on the cliffs. She doesn't need their approval to know the truth of her discoveries. Still you can sense the tension, pride, frustration, determination all braided together. And tomorrow she'll rise again, hammer in hand, ready to uncover the next beast the scholars will puzzle over. Because while they argue in London, Mary Anning is still out here, knee-deep in mud, listening to the cliffs breathe. The wind cuts sharp along the cliffs and you hunch deeper into your coat as Mary scrambles ahead, her hammer clinking against the rocks. She's chasing a lead, something strange, jutting from a recent landslide. The cliffs have moods, she always says, and today they seem generous. The earth has peeled back just enough to reveal a curve of bone, smooth and pale against the dark shale. She works at it carefully, fingers brushing soil away, tapping just so with the hammer. Hours pass, the tide creeping closer, the sound of gulls circling overhead. And then the shape emerges, a long neck, absurdly long, vertebra after vertebra, unfurling like beads on a string. It stretches further than any skeleton she's seen before. The head, when she reaches it, is small, almost delicate, with teeth sharp as pins. You stare stunned because this isn't an ichthyosaur. This is something stranger, almost comical in its proportions. A lizard with a swan's neck. A sea creature that looks like a dragon from a child's dream. This is Mary's discovery of the plesiosaur. Here's the mainstream fact. In 1823, Mary uncovered the first complete skeleton of a plesiosaur, an animal no one had ever imagined. Its long neck and tiny head baffled scientists. Georges Cuvier, the great French naturalist, at first thought it a fraud, so improbable was its design, but Mary's find was undeniable. It shook the scientific world as profoundly as her ichthyosaur. And now for the quirky tidbit. When word spread of her plesiosaur, some Londoners laughed at its shape, comparing it to a serpent threaded through a turtle. One satirical cartoon showed it coiling around ships like some sea monster from a sailor's tale. You grin, Mary's cliffside discovery had crossed the line from science into pop culture, at least for a moment. Historians still argue whether Mary herself grasped just how revolutionary this creature was. Did she know it would cement her reputation among fossil hunters and scientists alike? Or was she simply relieved that it might fetch a good price to keep her family afloat another winter? Likely it was both. You watch her step back from the exposed skeleton, her face flushed with triumph. She calls for help, and with painstaking effort the bones are removed, crated, and eventually sold. Soon the plesiosaur skeleton is drawing crowds in London, visitors gawking at the impossible neck scholars furiously scribbling notes. And somewhere in the margins of those notes, the name Mary Anning occasionally flickers, no longer just a rumour, but a necessary acknowledgement. Yet back in Lyme Regis, life goes on much the same. Mary still wakes before dawn, trudges out with her basket eyes the cliffs for the next find. The plesiosaur doesn't lift her into wealth or security. It doesn't earn her a lecture hall or a chair at the Geological Society. Instead, it brings her a kind of reluctant respect. Men who once doubted her skill now admit grudgingly that she is unmatched in the field. And you can feel the shift in her. She's not just scraping for curios anymore. She's aware of the stakes. Each new discovery feeds into the grand debate about Earth's history. Extinction, evolution, the age of the planet, all of it swirls around the bones she pulls from the cliffs. She may not write the papers, but without her, there would be no papers to write. On stormy nights, she sits by the hearth sketching fossils in careful detail. Her drawings are precise, scientific, far beyond what most amateurs could produce. You imagine her pausing, shading in the curve of a vertebra, and smiling faintly as though the creature itself has whispered its story through the stone. And perhaps as the fire crackles and the sea roars outside, she wonders what else waits in the cliffs. If an ichthyosaur could leap out of the past, if a plesiosaur could stretch its neck into the present, then what other monsters lie buried, waiting for her hammer to wake them? The cliffs of Lyme Regis have given her wonders, and she knows they're not finished yet. The cliffs look almost innocent from a distance, golden faces rising against the grey sky waves lapping at their base. But the closer you walk with Mary, the more you sense their menace. Pebbles skitter down without warning, dust drifts like breath, and every so often a boulder groans loose and crashes to the beach below. To dig here is to gamble with your life. Mary knows this, and still, she presses forward, boots sinking into wet shingle, eyes scanning for the faintest outline of bone. You feel the sting of salt spray as she crouches by a fresh fall. The rock is still damp, almost steaming from its break. She taps, listens, and scrapes with her knife. Fossil hunting isn't just patience, it's danger married to instinct. Every shift of stone could reveal treasure, or it could bury you where you stand. The mainstream fact: in 1833, Mary herself nearly died in a landslide. A sudden collapse swept her from the cliffside. She survived, but her dog Trey, her loyal companion on countless hunts, was killed. It was a brutal reminder that the cliffs took as much as they gave. For Mary, each outing carried risk, yet she could never stay away for long. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some locals, half joking and half serious, muttered that the Annings were cursed, that no family could spend so much time beneath the cliffs without inviting disaster. You smirk at the thought of Mary rolling her eyes at the superstition, even as she tightened her scarf and went right back out the next morning. Historians still argue whether Mary ever felt fear in those moments, or if she buried it beneath her determination. Some describe her as almost fearless, storm-walking along the shore in all weathers. Others believe she carried a quiet dread, each creak of the cliffs reminding her of her father's early death from exposure and of Trey's sudden end. Perhaps both were true, the dread and the defiance tangled together. You watch as she edges closer to a cliff face streaked with shale. Pebbles rain down, ticking against her bonnet. She doesn't flinch. Instead, she braces her ladder, wedges it against the rock, and climbs. From the beach, you tilt your head back, heart pounding, while she perches halfway up the wall, tapping with her hammer as though she were standing safe in her parlor. The gulls wheel and cry overhead, mocking your nerves. And then, with a triumphant shout, she pries loose a slab, balancing it against her shoulder as she climbs back down. She lays it on the shingle and brushes away the debris. Imprinted there, sharp as the day it sank into mud, millions of years ago, is the skeleton of a fish, every scale preserved. Another prize, another fragment of history, yanked into daylight. Night falls and you follow her home, your ears still echoing with the cliff's groans. Inside the fire glows the fossil, drying near the hearth. Mary strokes it with a fingertip, almost tenderly, as though apologizing for the violence of its excavation. You realize that for her the danger is inseparable from the work. The cliffs demand a price, but they also pay in wonders no one else can claim. And tomorrow she'll rise again, shoulders squared, heading back to the same cliffs that tried to crush her, because the bones are always calling. The morning begins not with cliffs, but with coins. You sit with Mary at the small table in her shop, the air smelling faintly of damp stone and seaweed. Fossils line the shelves in neat rows, ammonites spiraling like frozen fireworks, fish slabs stacked like loaves of bread, fragments of reptilian jaws catching the light. This isn't just her collection anymore, it's her livelihood. Men and women from across Britain wander, in some with genuine curiosity, others with nothing more than coin purses and bragging rights. Collectors haggle, aristocrats strut, and the occasional clergyman comes in his brow, furrowed as though he's half afraid the bones might bite. One mainstream fact: by the 1820s and 1830s, Lyme Regis had become a hot spot for fossil tourism, and Mary was at its heart. Dealers, collectors, and even museum agents came to her tiny shop to purchase specimens. Though she lacked formal training, her expertise made her the trusted source for the rarest and most important finds. You lean against the counter as she bargains with a gentleman in a top hat. He eyes a vertebra slab, strokes his chin, and offers a pitifully low price. Mary's lips twitch. She knows the worth of her fossils better than anyone. She lets the silence stretch, then names her price. He frowns, blusters, and eventually pays. She wraps the fossil in brown paper, hands it over, and adds the coins to a small tin. Another day's survival secured. Now for the quirky tidbit: Mary sometimes joked that she had to part with her children whenever she sold a specimen. Each fossil she dug carried weeks of danger and labor, and though she needed the money, letting them go was always bittersweet. Imagine the ache of finding something extraordinary only to see it shipped away to London, never to be touched again. Historians still argue whether Mary ever saw herself as part of a larger network of fossil dealers or if she remained fiercely independent. Evidence suggests she kept her dealings sharp and practical, working with curators, selling to private collectors, and occasionally navigating less reputable middlemen. She knew the trade was riddled with shady practices, but she had little choice. To eat, she had to sell. The shop is never quiet for long. A young student might drop in eyes wide at the sight of a coiled ammonite. A wealthy lady follows buying polished snake stones to display on her mantle. Behind them, a museum agent inspects a crocodile skull, clearly calculating how quickly he can get it on a train to London. Mary handles them all with brisk politeness. And yet you can sense her frustration. These fossils aren't just trinkets or curiosities. They are chapters of Earth's hidden history. But to most buyers, they're trophies, status symbols, conversation pieces for parlors. Few see what Mary sees when she chips away at the shale. Few hear the whisper of ancient seas in the stone. Still, she plays the game. She knows which collectors will pay well, which dealers will resell, which scholars will argue endlessly over her finds. She knows when to hold back a specimen until the price rises and when to let one go because the cupboard is bare. Survival is as much about money as it is about bones. At the end of the day, when the shop shutters close and the street quiets, she sometimes unwraps one fossil she couldn't bear to sell. She sets it by the fire, tracing the outline of its ancient shape. A private treasure, a reminder that not everything must leave Lyme Regis. Some secrets she keeps for herself. The cliffs may be dangerous, the gentleman scholars dismissive, but in her shop surrounded by the bones she's rescued, Mary Anning rules her own small kingdom of stone. You walk with Mary along the winding streets of Lyme Regis, past stone cottages leaning with age and gardens blooming against the salty air. She carries a basket on her arm, not filled with fossils this time, but with fresh fish wrapped in paper. At first glance, she might seem like any other woman in town, except her mind is always on the cliffs. And tonight, she's headed not home, but to visit a friend who shares that obsession. Elizabeth Philpott opens her door with a smile, ushering Mary inside. The room is cozy, fire-crackling shelves lined not with books but with trays of delicate fossils. Fish, tiny and perfect, arranged like pages in a storybook. Elizabeth is older, unmarried, living with her sisters, and she has both the leisure and the means to collect. Where Mary brings muscle and instinct, Elizabeth brings patience and meticulous cataloguing. Together they are an unlikely but formidable pair. One mainstream fact: Elizabeth Philpott was a respected fossil collector in her own right, especially known for her extraordinary collection of fossil fish. She befriended Mary despite their differences in class and age, and the two women often worked together, sharing specimens and insights at a time when women were almost entirely excluded from scientific circles. You sit with them at the table as they spread out specimens. Elizabeth's fossil fish are wafer thin, their scales glinting under lamplight. Mary leans in, pointing out details only a cliff dweller would notice: a fin pressed at an odd angle, a jaw dislocated mid-bite. Their voices overlap in excitement, finishing each other's observations. For a moment, it's not about money or London scholars or keeping food on the table, it's about pure wonder. Now for the quirky tidbit: Elizabeth was known to preserve small fossil fish by soaking them in oil of lavender, which kept them from crumbling but left the room smelling like a perfumery. Imagine that two women in aprons surrounded by ancient bones, the air heavy with lavender, like some eccentric alchemy. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth acted as more than just a friend, perhaps also as Mary's mentor in navigating a world stacked against her. Some suggest that Elizabeth's social standing shielded Mary at times, lending her credibility among gentlemen collectors who might otherwise dismiss her as a curiosity herself. Others argue their bond was simpler, a genuine companionship born of shared passion, rare and precious in a small seaside town. As the evening wears on, you notice how easily Mary laughs here, how her shoulders soften. With Elizabeth there is no bargaining, no need to prove herself. Only conversation sketches and the joy of discovery. Elizabeth listens when Mary describes the groan of cliffs before a landslide the way a jawbone feels under the hammer. And Mary in turn respects Elizabeth's meticulous records, her quiet insistence that every fish fossil deserves its place. Outside, the sea crashes against the cob, but in this room, time feels suspended. Two women overlooked by official science piecing together truths the world is barely ready to hear. They don't call themselves scientists, though by any measure they are. When Mary rises to leave, Elizabeth presses a small slab into her hand, a gift, a token of friendship. Mary smiles, truly smiles, and tucks it into her basket. The cliffs may be dangerous, the scholars dismissive, but here in the circle of lamplight she is not alone. The days grow longer, the gulls louder, and yet the arguments only grow sharper. You stand with Mary in her shop as another carriage rattles past outside, carrying away a crate of bones. She dusts her hands and sighs, for she knows the moment that box reaches London, the real storm begins not of waves but of words. The mainstream fact Mary's discoveries ignited some of the fiercest scientific debates of the early 19th century. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, even the great flying reptiles she unearthed later, all forced naturalists to confront uncomfortable questions. Extinction was one. If God created a perfect world, how could whole species simply vanish? Another was the Earth's age. Did the fossils point to a history stretching far beyond the biblical timeline? Mary doesn't sit in those lecture halls, but she hears the echoes. Visitors tell her of learned men red-faced with passion, arguing whether her plesiosaur was a lizard, a serpent, or some hoax stitched together for profit. She smirks at the thought. If only they had seen her balanced on a ladder, mud caked to her boots, teasing vertebrae from the cliff with her own hands. Now for the quirky tidbit, one clergyman insisted that fossils were merely the devil's tricks planted to test faith. Another claimed they were remnants of creatures drowned in Noah's flood, scattered like divine breadcrumbs. You can almost hear Mary's dry chuckle, because nothing she saw in the rock felt like a prank, nor did it fit neatly into Sunday sermons. Historians still argue whether Mary herself leaned toward religious explanations or scientific ones. Raised in a devout family, she never spoke openly against the church, yet her work placed her at the center of questions that rattled theology. Did she quietly reconcile faith with fossils? Or did she bite her tongue, letting others wrangle over interpretations while she kept hammering at stone? You watch her one evening, crouched by the fire, sketching another fossil slab. The lamp flickers, casting her profile in shadow. Her pencil is steady, deliberate. It strikes you that while the scholars debate extinction in crowded halls, Mary is writing her own argument in graphite lines and broken shale. She doesn't speak their language of Latin names and long speeches, but her evidence is irrefutable. And perhaps that is why the debates rage so fiercely. Each bone she finds is a challenge to certainty. Every jawbone whispers the world was not always as you think. Every vertebra declares life has vanished before and may again. You lean back, letting the thought settle like the tide rolling in. Mary doesn't need to raise her voice, her cliffs do it for her. And the arguments, though heated, only confirm what she already knows. In her bones, the Earth's history is vast, strange, and far beyond the tidy stories men tell in pulpits or lecture halls. Tomorrow she'll go back to the cliffs because the next discovery may silence one debate or ignite a new one. Either way, she is ready. The rain eases into a mist, and you walk with Mary down the high street, her shawl pulled tight, her boots striking puddles with familiar rhythm. She's older now, her step steady but slower, her face more lined from years of wind and worry. Yet the basket on her arm still swings heavy with stone because her work hasn't stopped. By now her name has travelled far beyond Lyme Regis. Whispers of the fossil woman ripple through learned circles in London, Paris, even across the Atlantic. Scholars write papers describing ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and while some forget to mention her, others finally do. A line in the margin, a footnote, or occasionally a bold acknowledgement that the discovery belongs to Mary Anning of Lyme Regis. One mainstream fact: in 1838, the British Association for the Advancement of Science granted Mary a modest annual pension in recognition of her contributions. It wasn't wealth, but it was rare acknowledgement from an establishment that had long ignored her. At last, some recognition trickled through the cracks. She still spends her mornings on the beach, but now visitors arrive not just to buy fossils, but to meet her. A student from Oxford kneels by her fire, peppering her with questions. A French geologist inspects her specimens with wide-eyed respect. For once, Mary isn't just a supplier, she's a voice in the conversation. And here's the quirky tidbit Charles Dickens years later wrote about Mary in an article describing her as a woman who won a name for herself and deserved to win it. Imagine that one of the most famous writers of the age pausing to honor the fossil hunter of Lyme. Historians still argue whether Mary truly felt satisfied with this late recognition. Some say she was proud, finally vindicated after years of being overlooked. Others believe it came too little too late, her poverty and hardships outweighing any honors. Perhaps she carried both feelings: gratitude for the acknowledgement and bitterness for the years when she was invisible. You picture her standing in her shop one afternoon, reading a letter aloud, the words shaky in her hands. "They've granted me a pension," she murmurs, a mix of disbelief and relief in her tone. Her friends cheer. Elizabeth Philpott smiles, and Mary allows herself a rare grin. It won't make her rich, but it means her work has been seen. Later, by the cliffs, she lifts her hammer once more. The tide rolls in gulls' cry, and the cliffs groan, as they always have. Recognition or not, she knows, she'll keep digging until her body refuses. For Mary Anning, fossils were never about fame. They were her life's language, written in stone and mud, whispering of worlds lost long before hers. And now at last, the world is beginning to listen. The years press heavier now, and you can feel it in Mary's step. She still climbs the shingle beach, still scans the cliffs with sharp eyes, but her body betrays her. A cough lingers too long, her shoulders stoop, and she rests more often on driftwood, the hammer idle in her lap. The cliffs seem almost watchful, as though they know their fiercest hunter is fading. The mainstream fact: in 1846, Mary Anning was diagnosed with breast cancer. Treatment in those days was rudimentary at best: herbal remedies, crude surgery, and more prayers than medicine. She endured the illness with the same quiet grit she had carried since childhood. Still, her energy waned, and the cliffs she had conquered for decades now seemed taller, steeper, more merciless. You sit with her by the hearth, the fossils arrayed like old friends. Her dog, Trey, is long gone, her father gone decades, her shop quieter than ever. Yet visitors still come, scholars still knock, students still beg for stories. She obliges when she can, voice thin but steady, telling them of the first ichthyosaur, of the plesiosaur's impossible neck, of landslides and storms. And here's the quirky tidbit: some locals in Lyme, long suspicious of Mary's fossil hunting, softened toward her in her final years. Where once they had whispered about curses and devil's tricks, now they took pride that their Mary had put Lyme Regis on the scientific map. The town baker might slip her an extra loaf, a fisherman tip his hat. Small kindnesses, but they mattered. Historians still argue whether Mary died content or disappointed. Did the late trickle of recognition and her small pension reassure her that she had mattered, or did she leave the world frustrated that her discoveries had enriched others far more than they enriched her? The truth may lie in between: a life of hardship, yet also a legacy written across the very bones of history. The illness worsens. By 1847, Mary can no longer climb the cliffs. She gazes at them from a distance instead, the waves foaming at their base, the gulls crying overhead. You imagine her whispering to herself, what else lies hidden there, waiting for another's hands to free it? On a July morning, the cliffs rise golden in the sun, and Mary Anning takes her last breath. She is only 47. The Geological Society, which never allowed her to join, publishes a eulogy in her honor, a rare gesture, one that admits finally her extraordinary place in science. You linger on the beach, the tide whispering at your feet. The cliffs are silent now, but they hold her story in every layer of stone. And though Mary is gone, her fossils remain bones that will keep arguing, Keep teaching, keep astonishing, long after her name is carved into memory. The tide rolls in soft tonight, the sky painted in pale silver, and you stand once more where Mary once walked. The cliffs loom unchanged, but the world has shifted. Her story, once whispered, now threads through museums' textbooks and the quiet awe of children pressing their faces against glass cases of bones. The mainstream fact, Mary Anning's discoveries laid the foundation for paleontology as a science. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, all central to understanding prehistoric life, were first revealed by her hammer and her stubborn determination. Today, her name appears in museum plaques, her fossils displayed with pride, and her role finally honored. But listen closely and you hear more than the polished tale. You hear the raw truth of a woman who fought poverty, danger, and dismissal, who sold her children for bread, who buried her dog beneath the cliffs, who scraped a life from mud and shale. Her legacy is not just bones in glass, but the spirit of persistence against a world reluctant to see her. Now for the quirky tidbit. In 2010, nearly 2 centuries after her greatest, finds the Royal Society named Mary Anning among the 10 most influential women in British science. Imagine that her name finally placed alongside giants who once overlooked her. The cliffs must have laughed to see it. Historians still argue whether Mary herself would recognize the scope of her legacy. Would she smile to see schoolchildren learning her name, museums telling her story, films and novels resurrecting her on screen and page? Or would she shrug, more concerned with the next stone to crack open than with statues or accolades? Perhaps both, because Mary lived for the hunt, but her finds outlived her. You walk the beach one last time, the stones clicking under your boots, the gulls wheel overhead, the wind tangles your hair, and the cliffs stand eternal. You imagine Mary's silhouette, their bonnet pulled low, hammer flashing in the sun. She is gone, but she lingers in every fossil shop, every museum case, every child's gasp at the sight of a prehistoric monster. And when the waves pull back, leaving ammonites gleaming in the sand, you almost expect to hear her voice. Keep looking, the past is never finished. And now, with the story told, the cliffs begin to fade into shadow. The waves soften their roar, quieting to a steady hush like breath against the shore. You feel the cool night air wrap around you, carrying the scent of salt and stone, and you let it ease you into stillness. Mary Anning's journey has run its course from stormy childhood to wind-swept cliffs to discoveries that shook the foundations of science. Her hammer is silent now, her shop shuttered, but the bones she unearthed still speak. They lie under museum lights, whispering of oceans long gone, of creatures who lived and vanished, of time itself, stretching farther than the eye can see. As you rest, you let her story linger, not as noise, but as a lullaby of persistence. A girl born into poverty, untrained, dismissed, yet determined to uncover the truth hidden in stone. Her life reminds you that greatness can rise quietly, without fanfare, from the humblest of places. The cliffs of Lyme Regis remain golden grey against the eternal tide. And though you will not climb them tonight, you can close your eyes and hear them breathe. Each stone holds a secret, each wave carries a memory, and somewhere in the distance, Mary walks still, her boots crunching on shingle, her basket heavy with the past. So you settle deeper, breathing slower, letting the sea's rhythm lull you. The story dims, the cliffs blur, and soon only the gentle sound of waves remains. Rest now, knowing that history is not just in books, but in stones, in whispers, in the quiet lives that shape the world. Sleep well, dream deep, and let the cliffs guard you through the night.